Blood stained the floorboards darker than any whiskey spill, and Clara Foster had stopped counting the men who bled out beneath her trembling hands by the third day of the territorial war between the ranchers and the mining company. The makeshift hospital in Carlin, Nevada, had been a saloon just a week ago in the summer of 1883, but now it reeked of carbolic acid, gunpowder burns, and death that clung to everything like cigarette smoke. She was 22 years old and had seen more suffering in 7 days than most people witnessed in a lifetime. Her white apron so permanently stained she had stopped trying to wash it clean. The screams haunted her even in the few hours she managed to sleep, curled up in a corner with her medical bag as a pillow, and her hands shook constantly now, a tremor she could not control no matter how hard she pressed them together in prayer. Wade Montgomery rode into Carlin on the 8th day of the conflict, with 3 bullet wounds in his side, and a reputation that preceded him by at least an hour. Clara heard the whispers from the other nurses before she saw him, how he was a ranch hand from the Northern Territories who had gotten caught in an ambush while trying to deliver a message of peace between the warring factions. He was 24, tall enough that 2 men had to support him through the door, and when they laid him on the only available table, his gray eyes found hers with an intensity that made her forget for just a moment about the blood pooling beneath him. She had learned to assess injuries quickly, to determine who could be saved and who was too far gone, and something in her chest tightened when she realized he was right on that terrible edge between life and death. "Madam," he managed through gritted teeth, his voice rougher than sandpaper but somehow gentle. "I apologize for the inconvenience." The absurdity of apologizing while dying almost made her laugh, but instead she pressed clean cloth to his wounds and called for hot water. His skin was burning with fever already, infection setting in fast under the Nevada heat that turned the former saloon into an oven. She cut away his shirt with scissors that had cut away so many shirts before, revealing a muscled torso marked with old scars and 3 fresh wounds that oozed blood and something worse. The other nurses were busy with 2 miners who had been caught in a dynamite accident, their screams filling the space, and Clara found herself alone with this cowboy who watched her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her exhausted soul. "This is going to hurt," she warned, reaching for the probe to check if the bullets were still lodged inside. "Cannot hurt worse than watching what is happening to this town," Wade said, and then his jaw clenched as she began the painful work of checking the wounds. He did not scream like the others, but she felt his entire body go rigid, every muscle locked tight against the agony. Sweat poured down his face, soaking into the dark hair that curled against his forehead, and she worked as quickly as her shaking hands would allow. 2 bullets had passed clean through, but the 3rd was lodged near his ribs, dangerously close to vital organs. She would have to cut deeper to remove it, and they had run out of chloroform 3 days ago. "I need you to stay conscious," Clara said, meeting his eyes directly. "Can you do that for me? I need you to stay with me, Wade." She had heard his name from the men who brought him in, and using it now seemed to anchor him. He nodded once, sharp and deliberate, and she appreciated that he did not pretend to be braver than any man could be in such circumstances. She called for whiskey, not the rotgut that usually filled this establishment, but the decent bottle the doctor kept hidden for surgical purposes. The doctor himself was 3 buildings down, trying to save a ranch owner's son, and Clara was on her own. She had assisted in dozens of bullet extractions over the past week, but this was the first she would perform entirely by herself, and her hands shook harder as she poured the whiskey over her instruments. "Drink," she instructed, holding the bottle to Wade's lips. He swallowed several mouthfuls, coughing slightly, and she saw his eyes water from the burn of it. Then she poured the rest over his wound, and he did cry out then, a sound that tore from his throat involuntarily. "I am sorry, I am so sorry, but I have to do this." "I know," Wade gasped. "I know you do, madam. I trust you." Those 3 words, spoken with such simple conviction by a man who did not know her at all, nearly broke something inside Clara's chest. She positioned her scalpel, said a quick prayer, and began to cut. Wade's hand shot out and gripped the edge of the table so hard she heard the wood creak, but he kept his eyes open and fixed on her face. She tried to work quickly, following the path of the bullet, her fingers sliding in blood as she searched for the metal that did not belong inside human flesh. The smell was overwhelming, copper and infection and that sickly sweet odor of damaged tissue, and she had to swallow back bile as she probed deeper. "Talk to me," Wade suddenly said through clenched teeth. "Please, just talk to me about anything." Clara understood. He needed distraction from the sensation of her fingers inside his body, from the violation of the surgery itself. "I came here from Philadelphia," she heard herself say, her voice shaking almost as badly as her hands. "I wanted to help people on the frontier, thought I would see beautiful landscapes and help with childbirth and ordinary illnesses. I have been here for 2 months, and I have seen nothing but blood and death and men killing each other over land and money and pride." Her fingers brushed metal, and she felt a surge of relief so intense she nearly sobbed. Carefully, so carefully, she maneuvered the forceps around the bullet and began to extract it. Wade's breathing had gone harsh and rapid, and she could see he was close to passing out from the pain. "Stay with me," she urged. "I have almost got it. You are doing so well, Wade, just another moment." The bullet came free with a wet sound that would haunt her later, and she dropped it into a metal pan where it clinked against the others she had removed over the week. Immediately she packed the wound with clean cloth soaked in carbolic acid, and Wade's entire body jerked. "Done," she said quickly. "The worst is done, I just need to stitch you closed now." Wade's chest was heaving like he had run a mile, and when she looked at his face she saw tears streaking through the dirt and sweat. But he was still conscious, still watching her with those gray eyes that held something she could not quite name. As she began the careful work of stitching the wounds closed, her hands finally steadied. This part she knew, the rhythmic pierce and pull of needle through skin, creating neat rows of stitches that would hold him together while his body tried to heal itself. She had gotten good at stitching over the past week, though she hated that she had needed to develop such skill. "You have gentle hands," Wade said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Even when you are cutting into a man, they are gentle." Clara did not know how to respond to that. Her hands did not feel gentle. They felt like instruments of necessary cruelty, inflicting pain in the name of healing. She finished the stitching in silence and bandaged him tightly, wrapping long strips of relatively clean cloth around his torso. He had lost a lot of blood, and she did not know if he would survive the night. Infection took most of them in the end, fever burning them up from the inside no matter how carefully she cleaned the wounds. "You need to rest," she told him, helping to shift him onto one of the cots that lined the walls. Every cot was full, men in various states of injury and illness, and the 2 miners were still screaming as another nurse tried to tend their burns. Clara felt exhaustion pulling at her like a physical weight, dragging her down, but there were still other patients who needed checking, wounds that needed redressing, and no time to stop. Wade's hand caught her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. "When did you last sleep?" "I do not remember," Clara admitted. "Tuesday, perhaps? What day is it now?" "Thursday," Wade said. "You need to rest too, Clara." She had not told him her name, but it must have been written on the board near the door where they tracked the nurses' schedules. Hearing him say it sent an unexpected warmth through her exhausted body. "People need help," she said simply, "and you cannot help them if you collapse from exhaustion." Wade's eyes were already drifting shut, the combination of blood loss and whiskey pulling him toward unconsciousness, but he fought to keep them open. "Promise me you will rest, even an hour." "I promise," Clara lied, because she had learned over the past week that sometimes lies were kinder than truth. She gently extracted her wrist from his grip and moved to the next patient, a young miner with a crushed hand that would likely need amputation. The work continued, endless and grinding, and she lost track of time until suddenly the doctor was shaking her shoulder and telling her to go sleep, or he would have her removed from the hospital. Clara looked down and realized she was standing over a patient with a needle in her hand, completely frozen, unable to remember what she had been doing. The shaking in her hands had spread to her entire body. The doctor, a gruff man named Stevens who had been working just as hard as any of them, physically steered her toward the small room in back where the nurses could rest. 6 hours, he ordered. "I will wake you in 6 hours. You are no good to anyone like this, Miss Foster." Clara wanted to argue but found she could not form the words. She collapsed onto the narrow bed without even removing her boots, and sleep claimed her instantly. Her dreams were full of blood and screaming and gray eyes watching her work with an expression that might have been trust, or might have been something else entirely. She woke to dim lamplight and the doctor shaking her shoulder again, and for a disoriented moment she could not remember where she was or why her hands hurt so badly. Then it all came crashing back and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. "Your cowboy made it through the night," Dr. Stevens said, and it took Clara a moment to understand what he meant. Wade. He was talking about Wade. "Fever is up but not dangerously so yet. He has been asking for you." Clara splashed water on her face from the basin in the corner, tied her hair back more securely, and returned to the main room. Dawn light was filtering through the windows, turning everything golden and deceptively peaceful. The screaming had stopped, which meant the miners had either been given laudanum or had died. She did not ask which. Wade was awake, sitting propped against the wall with his bandaged torso visible above the thin blanket someone had draped over him. His face was flushed with fever, but his eyes were clear and they tracked her movement across the room. "You actually slept," he said, sounding surprised. The doctor insisted. Clara checked his forehead with the back of her hand, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "You are running a fever." "I have had worse," Wade said, though Clara suspected that might not be true. She unwrapped his bandages carefully, checking the wounds for signs of infection. They were red and inflamed, but not yet showing the telltale black edges that meant gangrene. She cleaned them again with carbolic acid, and this time Wade barely flinched. "How many have you lost?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "What? Since this all started, how many have died on your watch?" Clara's hands stilled. She had not let herself count, had deliberately avoided tallying the dead because she knew the number would destroy her. "I do not keep track," she said, resuming her work. "Yes, you do," Wade said gently. "I can see it in your eyes. You remember every single one." He was right, and Clara hated that he could read her so easily. 17, she whispered. 17 men have died while I was tending them. 3 more died before I could even get to them. I do not know how many the other nurses lost, or what happened to the ones the doctor was treating. But 17 died in my hands. Wade was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "That means you saved many more. How many are alive right now because of you?" Clara had not thought of it that way. She had only been able to see the failures, the men she could not save no matter how hard she tried. "I do not know," she admitted. I am alive because of you, Wade said. That is one. Look around this room, how many others? She did look around, really looked for the first time since this had all started. The young ranch hand with the leg wound that should have killed him but was slowly healing. The miner who had taken a bullet to the shoulder and would keep his arm because she had cleaned the wound quickly enough. The merchant caught in crossfire who had lost so much blood she thought he would surely die, but who was sitting up now and eating broth. Maybe a dozen men in this room alone owed their lives to her skill and stubbornness. I only see the ones I lost, Clara said quietly, finishing the fresh bandaging. I know, Wade said. But that is because you care about every single life. That is what makes you good at this, even though it is tearing you apart. The understanding in his voice threatened to crack the careful walls Clara had built around her emotions. She had not cried since the first day, had not allowed herself to feel anything but the immediate urgency of the next task. If she let those walls break now, she was not sure she would be able to put herself back together. I need to check on the others, she said, standing abruptly. But Wade's hand caught hers again, and this time he held on despite his weakness. My name is Wade Montgomery. I work for the Triple M Ranch up north. I like my coffee black and my horses fast. I have 2 brothers and a sister back in Wyoming, and my mother makes the best apple pie you ever tasted. I am 24 years old, and I have never been shot before this week. Clara stared at him, confused by this sudden stream of information. Why are you telling me this? Because to you I am just another wounded man, another body to keep alive, Wade said. But I am a person, Clara, we all are. And you need to remember that the ones you save are people with families and lives and futures. That matters. You matter. Something in Clara's chest cracked then, just a hairline fracture, but enough that she felt tears burning in her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. I cannot do this right now, she said, but she did not pull her hand away. When can you do it? Wade asked. When this is over. Do you think you will be able to process all of this later after you have shoved it down for so long? He was wrong. He had to be wrong, because Clara could not afford to fall apart right now when people still needed her. But his thumb was moving gently across her knuckles, such a simple gesture of comfort, and she found herself sinking down to sit on the edge of his cot, just for a moment. Just to catch her breath. I came here to help people, she said, the words tumbling out unbidden. I trained for 3 years in Philadelphia, learning proper nursing techniques from the best doctors. I read everything I could about frontier medicine and desert survival. I thought I was prepared for anything, but nothing prepared me for this. Nothing prepared me for holding a man's hand while he dies because there is nothing more I can do for him. Nothing prepared me for the smell or the sounds or the way blood gets under your fingernails, and you can never quite get it clean. Wade listened without interrupting, and somehow that made it easier to keep talking. Clara found herself telling him about the first man who had died, a young ranch hand barely 18 who had taken a bullet to the gut. She had known immediately that he would not survive, but she had held his hand and lied to him, telling him he would be fine, letting him believe he would see his sweetheart again. She told Wade about the miner who had begged her to let him die because the pain was too much, and how she had given him laudanum but not enough to actually kill him, walking that terrible line between mercy and murder. She told him about the nightmares she had during those few brief hours of sleep, where her hands were covered in blood that would not wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. She told him about the guilt she felt every time she ate or rested, knowing that men were suffering while she tended to her own needs. And Wade listened to all of it, his gray eyes never leaving her face, his hand holding hers with gentle strength. When she finally ran out of words, Clara felt lighter and heavier at the same time, as if she had set down a burden but could now feel its true weight. "I am sorry," she said, suddenly embarrassed. "You should be resting, not listening to me fall apart." "You are not falling apart," Wade said firmly. "You are being honest about what you have been through. That is not the same thing." He shifted carefully, wincing at the pull of his stitches. "Can I tell you something, Clara? You are the strongest person I have ever met." "And I have met a lot of tough people in my line of work." Clara shook her head. "I do not feel strong. I feel like I am barely holding on." "That is what strength is," Wade said. "It is not about never being afraid or never feeling like you might break. It is about holding on anyway, about getting up every day and doing the work even when it costs you everything. You have been doing that for over a week now. That is real strength." Before Clara could respond, Dr. Stevens called her name from across the room. Another patient needed tending, and she was needed immediately. She squeezed Wade's hand once and then stood, slipping back into the role of competent nurse. But something had shifted between them in that conversation, some connection forged that went deeper than patient and caretaker. She felt it in the way her chest ached when she walked away from him, and in the way his eyes followed her around the room all morning. The day passed in the usual blur of bandage changes and wound cleanings and the constant fight against infection. By afternoon, a rancher came to the hospital with news that a temporary truce had been called. Both sides had lost too many men, and the territorial governor had finally arrived with federal marshals to enforce peace. The fighting was over, at least for now. Clara should have felt relief, but instead she just felt numb. The damage was already done. 23 men were dead that she knew of, maybe more, and countless others were wounded and would carry the scars forever. Wade's fever climbed higher as the day wore on, and by evening Clara was seriously worried. She sponged him down with cool water every hour, but the heat radiating from his skin only seemed to increase. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, and sometimes mumbling about horses and his family in Wyoming. Clara stayed by his side during her brief breaks, watching the flush on his cheeks, and praying that the infection would not take him after he had survived the initial trauma of the gunshots. At midnight, when the hospital was as quiet as it ever got, Clara sat beside Wade's cot with her head in her hands. She was so tired she could barely think, but his fever was too high for her to leave him alone. If it did not break soon, she would lose him, and the thought was unbearable in a way that went beyond professional concern. Somehow, over the course of a single day, Wade Montgomery had become important to her in a way she did not fully understand. "Clara," Wade's voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry. She quickly held a cup of water to his lips and he drank gratefully. "You should sleep." "So should you," Clara said, pressing her hand to his forehead again, still burning hot. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot 3 times, Wade said with a weak attempt at humor. Then his expression grew serious. "If I do not make it through this—" "Stop," Clara interrupted. "Do not talk like that." "If I do not make it," Wade continued stubbornly, "I want you to know that meeting you was worth getting shot for. You gave me the first real conversation I have had in months, maybe years. You treated me like a person, not just another wounded cowboy. That matters, Clara." "You are going to live," Clara said fiercely. "I did not spend hours digging bullets out of you just to lose you to fever. You are going to survive this, Wade Montgomery, because I am not done learning about you yet. You told me about your family and your coffee preferences, but I do not know what you dream about or why you became a ranch hand or what you want from life beyond fast horses. So you need to live so I can find out." Wade's hand found hers in the darkness. "What I want from life just changed pretty dramatically," he said quietly. "I want to know you, Clara Foster. I want to hear about Philadelphia and what made you brave enough to come west alone. I want to know what you dream about and what makes you laugh. I want to see you smile, a real smile, not the professional one you give your patients, and I cannot do any of that if I die tonight." "Then do not die," Clara said, and her voice broke on the words. "Please, Wade, just fight a little longer." "For you," Wade said, his eyes drifting shut again. "I will fight for you." Clara stayed awake all night, changing the cool cloths on his forehead and chest, monitoring his breathing, praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the darkness was deepest and her hope was nearly gone, she felt Wade's forehead and realized the heat was less intense. She checked again, pressing her hand to his neck and chest, and yes, the fever was definitely breaking. His breathing had evened out, and the flush on his cheeks was fading to something more natural. Relief hit Clara so hard she started shaking all over again. Wade was going to live. The infection was retreating and his body was winning the fight. She lowered her head to the edge of his cot and let herself cry, silent tears soaking into the rough blanket, releasing some of the terrible pressure that had been building inside her for over a week. She cried for the 17 men who had died, for the suffering she had witnessed, for her own exhaustion and fear, and the pieces of her innocence that had been stripped away by this experience. And she cried with gratitude that Wade would not be number 18, that his gray eyes would open again, and he would keep his promise to tell her more about himself. When the tears finally stopped, Clara sat up and wiped her face with her apron. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside, and Dr. Stevens would be here soon to start the day shift. She cleaned Wade's wounds one more time, pleased to see that the inflammation was decreasing and the edges were beginning to show signs of healthy healing. He slept peacefully through her ministrations, his body finally able to rest now that the worst of the crisis had passed. Over the next 3 days, Wade grew steadily stronger. His appetite returned and he could sit up without help, though standing was still beyond him due to blood loss and weakness. Clara found herself spending all her free time at his bedside, and she told herself it was just to monitor his recovery, but she knew it was more than that. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and pieces of themselves they rarely showed to anyone. Wade told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, learning to ride before he could walk, and the way the mountains looked at sunrise. Clara told him about Philadelphia society and the expectations she had fled, the suffocating propriety that demanded she marry well rather than pursue her passion for nursing. "I thought I would find freedom out here," Clara admitted one afternoon while changing his bandages. "Instead, I found a different kind of cage. The frontier is just as rigid in its expectations as Philadelphia, just in different ways. Women are supposed to be either wives or prostitutes, with very little room for anything else." "You are neither of those things," Wade observed. "You are something entirely yourself." "That is the problem," Clara said with a slight smile. "I do not fit anywhere." "Maybe you just have not found the right place yet," Wade suggested. His hand covered hers where it rested on his shoulder, and the touch sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Maybe the right place is not a location but a person." Clara's breath caught at the implication in his words. She had been trying not to examine too closely what she felt for Wade, telling herself it was just gratitude and relief that he had survived. But she could not deny the way her heart beat faster when he smiled at her, or the way she looked forward to their conversations more than anything else in her day. "Wade," she said hesitantly. "I know it is too soon," Wade said quickly. "I know we barely know each other and I am still a patient in your care. But Clara, I have never met anyone like you. You are brilliant and compassionate and stronger than you give yourself credit for. When I am well enough to leave this hospital, I want to see you again. I want to court you properly, if you would allow it." Clara's mind raced with a dozen practical objections. She was a nurse with no family connections and limited prospects. Wade was a ranch hand who might be moving on to another job at any time. They had met during a crisis, and maybe what they felt was just the intensity of that situation rather than real affection. But when she looked into his gray eyes and saw the hope and vulnerability there, all her objections faded. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." Wade's answering smile was so bright it transformed his entire face, and Clara felt her own lips curve in response. A real smile, the kind he had said he wanted to see. Around them, the hospital continued its routine of healing and suffering, but for this one moment they existed in their own small bubble of happiness. By the end of the second week after the fighting had ended, most of the patients had been discharged or transferred to more permanent care facilities. The makeshift hospital was closing, and the building would return to being a saloon. Clara had been offered a position at the small clinic in town, and she had accepted, knowing that Carlin needed medical care even without an active conflict. Wade was well enough to walk short distances now, though his wounds were still healing and he would carry the scars forever. The doctor had declared him fit to leave, and Wade had announced his intention to stay in Carlin rather than returning to his ranch job up north. "I sent word to my boss," Wade told Clara as she helped him pack the few belongings he had arrived with. "Told him I found a reason to put down roots. He understood. Wished me luck, actually." "And what reason is that?" Clara asked, though her cheeks were warm because she knew the answer. Wade turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. They were alone in this corner of the room, the other nurses busy elsewhere, and he took advantage of the privacy to speak honestly. "You, Clara, you are the reason. I know it is fast and maybe I am crazy, but I cannot imagine leaving this town and never seeing you again. I cannot imagine going back to my old life and not having you in it." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What will you do here?" "Carlin is not much of a town for ranch work. The mercantile owner mentioned needing help with deliveries," Wade said. "And there is talk of the railroad coming through in a year or two, which means construction work. I will find something. As long as I can be near you, the work does not matter as much." It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to Clara, and she felt tears prick her eyes again, though this time from happiness rather than grief. "I would like you to stay," she admitted. "These past 2 weeks have meant more to me than I can properly express. You helped me survive the worst experience of my life, Wade. You reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place." Wade lifted one hand to cup her cheek gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "You saved my life, Clara, literally and in every other way that matters. I came into that hospital expecting to die, and instead I found you. That is a miracle I do not take lightly." He kissed her then, soft and careful, mindful of the public setting and his still healing injuries. It was a chaste kiss by most standards, just a gentle press of lips, but it sent electricity racing through Clara's entire body. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, and Clara felt lighter than she had in months. The horrors she had witnessed were still there, still a part of her now, but they no longer defined her entire existence. Wade had shown her that she could survive trauma and still find joy, still find connection and hope and love. The hospital officially closed 3 days later. Clara reported to her new position at the clinic, where the work was mercifully routine compared to what she had been doing. Minor injuries, childhood illnesses, the occasional difficult childbirth. It was what she had imagined when she first came west, and she found satisfaction in the work, even as she continued to process everything that had happened during those 2 terrible weeks. Dr. Stevens stayed on as well, and together they provided medical care to Carlin and the surrounding ranches and mines. Wade found work at the mercantile as he had predicted, driving wagon deliveries to the outlying properties. It was steady work that paid decently, and he rented a small room above the general store. He courted Clara properly, as he had promised, taking her to the occasional social event and on walks around the town in the evenings when they were both finished with work. They talked endlessly, learning each other's histories and dreams and daily thoughts. Wade was easy to talk to, patient and genuinely interested in everything Clara had to say. He never dismissed her opinions or expected her to diminish herself to make him feel more important, which was refreshing after Clara's experiences with Philadelphia society men. 3 months after they met, Wade took Clara on a picnic up in the hills outside Carlin, where the Nevada landscape stretched out in austere beauty. They sat on a blanket and ate cold chicken and fresh bread, while watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Wade's wounds had healed into 3 puckered scars that he claimed barely bothered him, though Clara noticed he still moved carefully at times. She had told him about the nightmares that still woke her some nights, dreams of blood and dying men, and he had held her without judgment or demands that she simply get over it. "I love you," Wade said suddenly, setting down his plate and turning to face Clara directly. "I have loved you since you stood over me with a scalpel and refused to let me die. I know it has only been 3 months, but I know my own heart, Clara. I love you and I want to build a life with you." Clara's breath caught in her chest. She had known this was coming, had felt it in the way Wade looked at her and touched her and made space for her in his life. But hearing the words spoken aloud still made her dizzy with joy. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saw me at my worst, when I was barely holding myself together, and you treated me with such gentleness and care. You made me remember who I was beneath the trauma. I love you, Wade Montgomery." Wade reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, simple silver with a single small stone. "It is not much," he said, "but it is what I can afford right now. Someday I will get you something better, I promise." "It is perfect," Clara said, and she meant it. The ring represented everything about their relationship, forged in hardship but full of hope for the future. Wade slipped it onto her finger and it fit perfectly, and then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, with passion tempered by respect. Clara kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into the connection between them. They were married 2 months later in the small church in Carlin, with Dr. Stevens standing as witness and half the town in attendance. Clara wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Wade wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she was meant to be, with this man who understood her so completely. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs together. Wade continued his delivery work, and Clara continued at the clinic, and they built a life together in the way that frontier couples did, with hard work and determination and love. The nightmares gradually faded for Clara, though they never disappeared entirely. Some experiences left permanent marks, and Wade understood that. On the nights when she woke gasping and trembling, he held her until the panic subsided, never making her feel weak or broken. A year into their marriage, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, because she had seen so many things go wrong with pregnancies and births during her nursing career. But Wade was thrilled. his excitement infectious, and gradually Clara allowed herself to share his happiness. Her pregnancy was thankfully uneventful, and in the spring of 1885 she gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named William after Wade's father. Clara had assisted at dozens of births, but experiencing it herself was entirely different, painful and terrifying and ultimately triumphant. Wade was with her through the entire labor, holding her hand and encouraging her, and when he held their son for the first time, Clara saw tears streaming down his face. "We made this," Wade said in wonder, staring at the tiny scrunched face of their newborn. "We made an actual person, Clara." "We did," Clara agreed, exhausted but happy. William latched on to nurse immediately, and Clara felt a fierce protective love surge through her. This child would grow up in a world where violence and hardship existed, but he would also know love and stability and parents who adored him. That seemed like the best any parent could offer. The railroad did come through Carlin 2 years later, transforming the small town into a more bustling community. Wade got a better-paying job working for the railroad company, supervising supply shipments, and they were able to afford a larger house with room for their growing family. Clara cut back her hours at the clinic after William was born, though she continued to work part-time because nursing was too much a part of her identity to give up entirely. She had become the person women in Carlin turned to for advice about pregnancy and child care, and she found satisfaction in being able to help in that way. When William was 3 years old, Clara gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine after Clara's mother back in Philadelphia. Clara had reconciled with her family by letter over the years, and though they did not fully understand her choices, they had softened enough to send gifts for the grandchildren they had never met. Catherine was a calm, easy baby compared to William's colicky infancy, and she had her father's gray eyes. Wade was utterly smitten with his daughter, carrying her everywhere and letting her wrap him around her tiny finger from the very beginning. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following years. Wade was promoted to assistant station manager at the railroad, a position that came with steady pay and respect in the community. Clara eventually opened her own small practice focused on women's health and midwifery, using skills she had developed through years of frontier nursing. The horrors she had witnessed during those 2 weeks in 1883 faded gradually into memory, still present, but no longer dominating her existence. She had learned to carry that experience without letting it crush her, to acknowledge the trauma while still moving forward with her life. William grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved books and learning. Catherine was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring despite her mother's lectures about ladylike behavior. Wade was an involved, loving father who treated his children with the same gentle care he had shown Clara from the very beginning. He taught William to ride and helped Catherine collect interesting rocks from the desert. He read to them every night and never made them feel that his love was conditional on their behavior. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade took Clara back to the hillside where he had proposed. They left the children with Dr. Stevens, who had become an honorary grandfather over the years, and rode out to watch the sunset together. Clara was 32 now, with threads of silver beginning to show in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of smiling. Wade was 34, more filled out than the lean cowboy who had stumbled into her hospital a decade ago, but still with those same gray eyes that saw straight into her soul. "You ever regret it?" Wade asked as they sat together on their blanket, his arm around her shoulders. "Giving up your career in Philadelphia, marrying a ranch hand turned railroad worker, staying in a small Nevada town instead of going somewhere bigger." Clara turned to look at him fully, seeing the vulnerability behind the question. Even after 10 years of marriage, he still sometimes doubted that he was enough for her. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once, Wade. You gave me the life I was looking for without even knowing I was looking for it. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You gave me space to be myself without trying to change me. How could I ever regret that?" Wade kissed her forehead, pulling her closer against his side. "I just want you to be happy." "I am happy," Clara said. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Wade admitted. "I was just drifting before I met you, Clara. Moving from job to job, never putting down roots, never really connecting with anyone. You changed everything for me. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something lasting. I look at our children and our home and our life together, and I cannot believe how lucky I got." They watched the sun set in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other during the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from that painful beginning. Clara thought about the 17 men who had died during those terrible 2 weeks, and she sent a silent prayer of gratitude that Wade had not become number 18. His survival had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had given her everything she held most dear. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast Nevada sky, Wade and Clara rode slowly back to town. Their children would be waiting for them, probably having thoroughly exhausted Dr. Stevens with their energy and questions. Tomorrow Clara had 3 expectant mothers to check on, and Wade had a shipment arriving that needed inventorying. Life would continue in its steady, satisfying rhythm of work and family and quiet joy. But tonight, riding through the desert with her husband of 10 years, Clara felt profoundly grateful for every moment that had led her to this point. The horrors she had witnessed nursing the wounded had nearly broken her, but Wade's gentle care had helped her heal even as she was healing others. Their love had been forged in blood and trauma, and the desperate fight to preserve life against overwhelming odds. It was not a romantic beginning by conventional standards, but it was theirs, and she would not trade it for anything. When they reached their house and saw the lamplight glowing warmly in the windows, William's face pressed against the glass watching for them, and Catherine probably already asleep, despite her best efforts to stay awake. Clara felt a surge of contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she had saved Wade for, she realized. Not just so he could survive his wounds, but so they could build this life together, so these children could exist, so they could have years and decades of love and partnership ahead of them. Wade helped her down from her horse and pulled her into a long, lingering kiss before they went inside. "I love you, Clara Montgomery," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Clara whispered back. "Forever." They walked into their home together, ready to reclaim their children and continue the beautiful, ordinary life they had built from the ashes of trauma and war. The Wild West was still wild in many ways, still harsh and unforgiving, but it had given Clara and Wade something precious. It had given them each other, and in the end, that made every hardship worthwhile. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. William eventually went to university in California, studying medicine because he had grown up watching his mother heal people and wanted to do the same. Catherine married a young engineer working on the railroad expansion and settled in Carlin just 2 streets away from her parents, giving Clara and Wade grandchildren to spoil in their later years. The clinic Clara had built became an institution in the town, and she trained 2 younger women to eventually take over her practice. Wade worked for the railroad until his retirement at 60, having risen to station manager and earning the respect of everyone who worked with him. He was known for being fair and compassionate, treating his workers with the same gentle care he had always shown his family. In the evenings, he and Clara would sit on their front porch and watch the sunset paint the Nevada sky in brilliant colors, talking about their day or their children, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and half the town of Carlin who had come to celebrate, Wade stood and raised his glass in a toast. "To my wife, Clara," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "who saved my life in more ways than one, who showed me what real strength looks like, who built a family and a practice and a life with me in this hard land. I was a drifting cowboy with no direction until 3 bullets and a lot of luck brought me to her door. Every day since has been a gift I never deserved but will always be grateful for." Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks as the crowd cheered and clinked their glasses. She looked around at the life they had built together, at the children who carried pieces of both of them forward into the future, at the community they had helped shape through decades of service and care. The horrors she had witnessed nursing the wounded during those 2 terrible weeks in 1883 would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She had survived trauma and found love on the other side. She had discovered that healing others and being healed yourself could happen simultaneously, that gentleness and strength were not opposites but 2 sides of the same coin. When the party finally ended and they were alone in their bedroom, Wade took Clara's hand and traced the simple silver ring he had given her 30 years ago. She still wore it, though he had indeed kept his promise and given her nicer jewelry over the years. But the original ring remained her favorite, a symbol of everything they had overcome to be together. "Thank you," Wade said quietly, "for saying yes, for building this life with me, for loving me even when I was just a broken cowboy on a table in a makeshift hospital." "You were never just that," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "You were always more. You just needed someone to see it, just like I needed someone to see me beneath the trauma and exhaustion. We saved each other, Wade. That is what love does." They fell asleep that night as they had for 30 years, wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. The Wild West had softened somewhat over the decades, civilization creeping in with railroads and telegraph lines and laws that were actually enforced. But the essential character of the place remained, that blend of harshness and beauty that demanded strength and rewarded perseverance. Clara Foster Montgomery had found both in abundance. She had witnessed the worst of human violence during those 2 weeks of territorial war, had held dying men in her arms and fought desperately to save lives in impossible conditions. But she had also discovered that even in the darkest moments, connection was possible. Love was possible. A cowboy with gentle hands and gray eyes that saw straight to her soul had shown her that trauma did not have to be the end of the story. It could be the beginning of something beautiful, if you were brave enough to keep going. And so she had kept going, day after day, year after year, building a life of purpose and love and quiet joy in the harsh Nevada desert. The nightmares eventually stopped altogether. The tremor in her hands faded with time and healing. The weight of those 17 deaths she carried would never fully disappear, but it was balanced now by all the lives saved, all the children safely delivered, all the years of service to her community. When Clara finally passed away at 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Wade held her hand exactly as he had held it that first terrible night when his fever nearly killed him. "Thank you for fighting," he whispered, echoing her words from 5 decades earlier. "Thank you for staying with me." Clara smiled, squeezed his hand weakly, and let herself rest at last, secure in the knowledge that the life she had lived had been full and meaningful and exactly what she was meant for. The girl who had fled Philadelphia to find herself in the Wild West had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, and the cowboy who had stumbled into her hospital had been her partner through all of it. Wade followed her just 6 months later, his heart simply giving out one peaceful morning. The town of Carlin mourned the loss of both pillars of their community, and their children buried them side by side with matching headstones that read simply, Clara Foster Montgomery, healer, and Wade Montgomery, beloved husband and father. They had lived long, full lives marked by love and service, and the kind of partnership that inspired everyone who knew them. Their story became a local legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. The tale of the nurse who survived the territorial war horrors and the cowboy who showed her gentleness in the midst of violence. It was a love story born from trauma, tempered by hardship, and sustained by mutual respect and deep affection. It was a story that belonged uniquely to the Wild West, to a time and place where people had to be tough to survive, but could still find softness in each other's arms. And it was a story that proved love could bloom even in the harshest soil, as long as two people were willing to tend it with care.